Good afternoon, welcome. I know people will continue to come in through my very brief introductory remarks, but just to stay on time, my name is Christina Stanch. I'm an associate professor of English here at VCU, and I direct the Humanities Research Center. I'd like to welcome you to Meet VCU Authors, and as many of you know, this Meet VCU Authors series invites our faculty, students, and community members to come to meet VCU authors as they talk about their recent publications and answer questions about their work. For me, it's also a celebration of this process, which tends to be long and unrecognized. So it's as much sharing as it is celebratory. Our speaker will present for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So as you have questions during the presentation, please post them in the Q&A box, and then we'll field them in the order in which they are received. So today I'm very excited to introduce you to Dr. S.J. Sindu, who is a Tamil diaspora author and assistant professor of creative writing in the English department at VCU. I'll have a few more words to say about Dr. S.J. Sindu in a moment, but Rani is reminding me that I should also thank everyone in the audience, including our alumni who often attend our events. And then if you're interested in making a gift to the center, please reach out to Rani for more details. So now back to the introduction. And thank you, Rani, for that reminder and also for keeping things going. I don't know if you know this, but we have 5 events at the center this week, which is exciting. 2 of them are today. And we're so excited that so many of you are joining us for this talk. So, S.J. Sindu joined the English department at VCU in fall 2022. She received her PhD in creative writing from Florida State University in 2017 and is already a very prolific author of 2 literary novels, Marriage of a Thousand Lies and Blue Skin Gods, 2 hybrid chapbooks, I Once Met You But You Were Dead, and Dominant Genes, 2 graphic novels, Shakti, you'll hear more about it today, and the forthcoming Tall Water, as well as a forthcoming collection of short stories called The Goth House Experiment, which I understand will be perfect for Halloween. Her research interests include queer studies, feminist theory, post-colonial studies, and critical race studies, South Asian diaspora literature, Tamil literature, and critical theory. Professor S.J. Sindu also teaches in the residency program at Vermont College of Fine Arts and is a co-editor for Zero Street, a literary fiction series at the University of Nebraska Press featuring LGBTQ+ authors. Last but not least, Sindu will also be co-directing or is already co-directing the new HRC Graphic Narratives Lab along with 2 other professors in the College of Humanities and Sciences, Dr. Grace Gibson and Dr. Bernard Means. And this lab, as you'll hear more from Sindu, examines comics and graphic novels and their importance in the humanities. If you'd like to learn more about that, please check out our website. Finally, today, SJ will be talking to us about their graphic novel, Shakti, a middle grade fantasy about an 11-year-old South Asian American girl, which draws from Tamil mythology and aims to make visible an often underrepresented culture. Congratulations on your new book and on all your forthcoming projects. Thank you so much for taking on co-directing the new lab on graphic narratives at the HRC, and welcome to Meet VCU Authors.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Christina and Rani, for inviting me to be part of this series. It's been, being involved with the HRC has been really wonderful. And so I'm just gonna jump in. So I'm going to talk for a little bit, and as you come up with questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, as Christina has said. So I'm going to talk to you about graphic narratives and visual storytelling. and also give you a little bit of a behind the scenes look at what it is to create a graphic novel. But first, I want to talk to you about the Graphic Narratives Lab. So this is a lab for VCU faculty, staff, students, and the greater community. And it's meant to be a central hub for those who are interested in graphic narratives. We're hoping to host events, panels, workshops, as well as an annual graphic comics contest. And we're going to focus on the importance of graphic narratives within the humanities. So whether that's for creative purposes or for educational purposes, we're hoping to blend a mix of study of comics, scholarship about graphic narratives, and the creation of graphic narratives. And I'm one of the co-directors along with Bernard Means and Grace Gibson. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about the behind the scenes process for Shakti, what it is to write comics versus traditional creative prose. So I am mostly a literary novelist. I started out writing just straight prose fiction. I also write prose nonfiction and a little bit of poetry, but graphic narratives are their own different form. And I want to talk about what that means, what it looks like, and the different ways in which graphic narratives are driven versus and structured versus a prose narrative. And I also want to talk a little bit about the traditional trade publication process. And trade means in the publishing world, when you have a trade book, it basically means you are it's a sort of a mass market kind of book. It's the kind of book that you would find in Barnes and Noble or most bookstores that are not specialized. So that's what trade kind of means. It's like your blanket kind of art audience is fairly mainstream. Let's talk about what is a comic. And I have this Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art cover by Scott McCloud. It is a book that I love and teach often. I'm actually teaching it in 2 different classes right now, in my writing for comics class, which is a workshop, and then in a literature class where we are focusing on the graphic novel. And in Understanding Comics, Scott McCloud comes up with a sort of working definition for comics, because it is so large, and this idea of graphic narrative, what exactly are we talking about? So what I mean when I say graphic novel or graphic narrative, I'm talking about sequential art that tells a story. So by this definition, we aren't talking about one panel comics. We're talking about multiple panel comics that tell a bigger story. They are comprised of static images. And this part of the definition is really important because we want to exclude animation and film. These are comprised of static printed images or web images, and the meaning is made through juxtaposition. And I think this is a key part of the definition of what is a comic or what is a graphic narrative. Juxtaposition meaning putting things close together to achieve some sort of resonance. The panels themselves, by being close together, create meaning. So the meaning in a comic is created through the juxtaposition of these static images, and the meaning becomes a bigger story. So that's our working definition of comics. Now let's talk about what is a graphic novel, which is a specialized form of comic. A graphic novel is a book-length work of fiction. There's also graphic memoir like Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, the cover of which is featured here. But graphic novel itself is fictional and is a story told through comics. So through sequential art that has static images that create meaning through juxtaposition, in a book form that is also fictional. That this includes, and the reason why I have the Sailor Moon cover up here is that it does include different kinds of graphic novels, including manga from different parts of the world. This is the cover of my graphic novel, Shakti, which came out in May of this year. Shakti is a fantasy graphic novel, which means that there are fantastical elements within it. It talks about magic. It talks about Hindu mythology. It has goddesses, and really what served as the inspiration for Shakti was that I have always loved the fantasy genre. I grew up reading a lot of manga and a lot of comics, but I never saw magic systems that were integrated in with my own heritage. I was raised Hindu. I am a 1.5 generation Tamil American, which means I moved to the US when I was young, but still old enough to remember my home country. So I did go through the immigration process with my family. I was born in Sri Lanka, and I came to the US when I was still a child. And I came to Massachusetts, and I came to Amherst, Massachusetts specifically, which is where Shakti is set. And if you've ever been to Massachusetts, especially around Halloween, you will understand that there's still a regional obsession with magic and witches, and that especially around the fall period, this regional obsession comes to life, mostly because of the Salem witch trials and the history of Massachusetts and witchcraft. And you know, a very sad, heavy history, but in its modern interpretation is sort of made into this interest in witchcraft and in Wicca. But I never really saw any other kind of non-European representation in terms of the magic and the witchcraft that was that my hometown was interested in, and even in the books that I saw. So part of my reason for writing Shakti was representation of different kinds of magic folklore, but also to have a character who is brown-skinned, who is South Asian, and very visible and allowed to be heroic on the page. And I thought that that was really important. I started writing Shakti as a prose novel, and I knew it was going to be a middle grade novel. I never thought I'd write for kids, but when I got this idea, I started to write a middle grade novel. It just didn't work as a prose novel, and I couldn't figure out why. And it was really frustrating. And so I put it aside. And then I was walking in the woods. It was fall. There were, is upstate New York. The colors of the leaves were turning. I was walking with my partner, and we were hiking through the woods. And I just, for some reason, the visual aspect of seeing the woods and seeing the fall colors made me think that maybe this novel, which is set around Halloween in Amherst, Massachusetts, should be a graphic novel. And so I started writing it as a graphic novel, and everything came together. It started to click. And for some reason, the visual element really started to drive the narrative. I'm going to talk to you about the process of writing Shakti, and then I will talk about the differences between writing it as a prose novel versus a graphic novel. So the first part of the process is the script. And there is no standardized script format for graphic narratives. Everyone kind of does it their own way. And this is the way I did it. The thing that is common between all these different formats is that in a graphic novel script, you are going page by page, panel by panel. And you are both describing the images that are in each panel and the text. So the text is either dialogue or a caption, or sometimes it's a special effect word like crash or punch or something like that. So these are the first 2 pages of my script. And you can kind of see that this this scene that I envisioned at the very beginning, which is an en medias res kind of scene. It's right in the middle of the novel, and then we kind of rewind back. This scene, in my conception, was 3 pages long and had 3 panels on the first page, 4 panels on the second page, and 3 panels on the third page. And I'm pointing this out because along the process, that's going to change. So this was my final script. And this was a script that was revised many, many times. I wrote it one way, and then I revised it with my agents. I revised it multiple times with my editor. And this was the final script that was given to the graphic illustrator. The second part of the process is character sketches. So the illustrator, who was actually my dream illustrator, a very, very talented artist named Nabi H. Ali. He took the script and he read through and came up with character sketches for each of the characters that's going to appear in the novel. And on the right-hand side, you will see the 2 Hindu goddesses that appear, Kali and Durga, and then all of the other characters that appear in the novel. And we went back and forth with character sketches. So when things were a little bit problematic, I would suggest different changes and Nabi would incorporate them. And that's kind of how we did the first part of the illustration process. The second part, or the second part of the illustration and the third part of the full process is called first pass. And these are sketches. So Nabi went through, and this is the same scene that I showed you in script form. And this is again, he did it pretty close to how I had written it. 3 panels on the first page, 4 panels on the second page, and 3 panels on the 4th page. And we went back and forth and did a couple of changes for change suggestions, at least. Me and the art director and the actual editor and the design department got together and went back and forth about these first pass sketches. The next stage of the process is pencils, or nowadays it's usually line art drawn in a digital format. It used to be actual pencil drawings that were then scanned in. And you see that this same scene has now gotten bigger and now takes up 4 pages. So now we're working with a 4-page spread, and we have 3 panels on the first page, 2 panels on the second page, 1 huge kind of splash page on the third, and then panels on the 4th page. The last stage of the process is full color. So again, with the pencils, we went back and forth. Everybody put in their 2 cents. These little yellow marks you see here are comments that people have put in. And this is the final as it appears in the book. So now it's 5 pages. It's the first 3 pages and then what's called a 2-page spread. So you kind of turn the page and you see 2 pages both together with this giant image. And you can see how the scenes have shifted, how the panels have shifted. And through this process, it's a very collaborative process, much more than a regular traditional prose novel would be. And the collaboration between me, the writer, the editor, the art director, the design department, and the illustrator helps the story really come to life. It helps the story grow and change. and come alive on the page in a way that isn't always possible when you're the only one writing a prose novel. So this is a much more group-centered and collaborative process. So writing for comics versus writing prose, what is the actual difference? Besides the process is completely different. The script, the format is completely different. But besides that, what are we talking about in terms of story? Do they function exactly the same? They don't. When you're writing for comics, the story is driven by plot and by visuals. So if you're looking at this spread of this scene, this introductory scene, the visuals themselves are doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. The colors, the stylistic nature of the illustrations are doing a lot of the work. If you look at the individual character expressions, that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. So the visuals themselves are driving the story forward. And it's very plot driven. Comics are necessarily plot driven because you don't have a sense of interiority and language. So in a traditional prose novel, the story is being driven by character interiority and by voice. So by character interiority, I mean the access we have to the brains of our characters. Sometimes it's told in first person where the character is literally telling us the story. Sometimes it's told in third person where we're hearing someone else, some other narrator tell us the story. But still, even then, we still have access to one or more characters' brains. And that access drives a lot of the story forward. The other thing is voice. So voice refers to the language, the cadence, the tone, the words that are being used, the rhythm of the language itself, all kind of combines into this amorphous thing that we call voice. And a lot of prose novels can be carried entirely by voice. If there is a strong enough voice, it can cover up a lack of plot. It can cover up other flaws in the novel. The access we have to character interiority can also cover up for a lot of other ways in which the novel might not be very strong, especially plot. But in comics, we do not have voice because we don't have language. We can only get a little bit of narration, we can get a tiny bit of exposition, and we can get a small amount of dialogue in each panel. We do not have the kind of language access that we do in a prose novel. And because of that, we cannot rely on voice and we cannot rely on character interiority. Because while some comics, and I'm thinking of popular comics like Spider-Man or Deadpool, have a lot of interiority. The characters talk to themselves. They talk to, in Deadpool, there's the breaking of the fourth wall where Deadpool is literally talking to us as readers, but we still don't have the kind of character interiority we would get in a traditional prose novel. So comics have to have a really strong plot and they have to have strong visuals to make up for the lack of interiority and voice. In comics, we get symbolism through images. And this is a way in which comics are sometimes stronger than prose novels because they're able to suggest certain feelings. They're able to evoke certain tones or moods just through the symbolism of images. Whereas in a prose novel, even if you're dealing with what we traditionally call images, it's still language. We are only getting symbolism through language itself. In a comic, a reader imagines all the senses except the visual. They are being given the visual element and they are imagining everything else. In prose, the reader is imagining all of the senses and including the visual. In comics, page order and formatting is everything. And in prose, formatting matters very little and will probably change when your novel goes into, gets typeset or gets put into book format. So let me talk a little bit about page order. So in the original, I had written page 1, page 2, page 3. Page order matters because you visualize a comic as 2 pages at once. You are not just visualizing 1 page, whereas with a book, you're going to only be reading 1 page at a time. With a comic, you're looking at physically both pages at the same time. And because it's a visual format, those 2 pages are working in tandem with each other to create some level of meaning. And it's important to understand that odd number pages are on the right-hand side and even number pages are on the left-hand side. So when I say page 1, it's going to be a blank page on the left-hand side and a page 1 on the right-hand side. And then you're going to flip the page. You're going to see page 2 and page 3. Now that matters because you want to control as I like to say that the difference between a beginning writer and a master writer is how well they can control the reader experience. And you want to be able to, even in comics, be able to control reader experience. So you need to know what they're seeing in terms of a 2-page spread, and then be able to control their reaction when they flip the page, because that flipping the page is part of the process of reading a comic. And that flipping the page creates tension, it creates suspense, and you want to exploit that. So in my original conception, page 1 on the left-hand side, page 2 and 3 together. And that's how the first pass sketches are. But this then puts page 1 on the left-hand side, page 2 and 3 together, and then page 4. So you actually see Shakti setting this bush on fire on page 3, and then you flip the page and see the actual thing that she has created. She has set this monster on fire, and this monster has inside a girl from her class. And in the full color, we realized that having just the monster being set on fire on one side of a 2-page spread is not very useful and is not taking advantage of the 2 pages that the reader is physically seeing at that particular moment. So we expanded it even more so that we get Shakti saying run, and then those 2 running on one side. That's the only thing we see. We flip the page, we see the monsters pursuing, we see Shakti set the bush on fire. You flip the page, and in each flipping the page, you're creating suspense. So you flip the page, and then you see a two-page spread of this monster catching on fire and literally melting off of the girl's face. So I wanted to kind of go through that because that page order and that formatting matters so much. It is such a huge part of how storytelling happens in the comic space. Okay. So this is my last part. Oh, sorry. So please get your questions ready because we are going to have quite a bit of time for questions after this. So I wanted to talk about the traditional publication process. For comics, there are 2 different kinds of publishers that exist in the US. One is a comics publisher. So comics publishers like Marvel, like DC, like Dark Horse Comics have been in existence for a very long time. Traditional, when I say traditional book publishers, I mean Simon & Schuster, Penguin Random House, Macmillan, HarperCollins, Hachette, these big publishers, Scholastic, who have traditionally not been into comics. They have published traditional books. Comics publishers usually work in issues. So they produce single issue comics that are 22 to 24 pages long. And then eventually they will collect a bunch of those single issue comics into volumes, and then they'll collect them into compendiums. Traditional book publishers, when they started to get into comics publishing, did not do and still don't do single issue comics. They only do volumes. So often what you'll see in terms of traditional book publishers who do graphic novels is that they do standalone graphic novels, or on the rare occasions that they do series, they are volumized series instead of single issue comics. A lot like how Japanese manga publishers work in volumes instead of single issues. That's the preface. I want to talk about traditional publication process, and the process I know best is through traditional book publishers who publish graphic novels that are standalone or series in volumes, and that's how Shakti was published. And this is a little bit different from comics publishing when you're doing single issue comics. So I just want to put that out there, but I'm going to talk only about this side because that's the side I know best. This is also very similar for traditional trade book publishing. So trade book publishing, including any nonfiction that is for a mass market audience, any kind of memoir, any fiction. So collections of short stories or novels will also function in this way when you're doing a traditional publisher that's fairly big. So you finish the manuscript. I'm going to go step by step. You finish the manuscript. And in terms of comics, for a traditional publication process, you are only talking about the script. When working with comics publishers, a lot of comics publishers will work with authors who are also illustrators or author-illustrator duos that work together already. But in the traditional publishing world, you are only selling your script. So I wrote the script, I finished the script. You're selling a finished product. Then you find an agent. So an agent is a go-between between you, the writer, and the publishing house. So the publishing house has an editor that you're normally working with, and the agent is sort of your manager, is doing a lot of the work that a manager would do in the music industry, and what a talent agent or manager would do in the entertainment industry. They fight for you, they work for you, they are your advocates to the publishing houses, and in return they get a portion of the money that you make. So how do you find an agent? You write what's called a query letter, which is a one-page letter that pitches your book, and you submit it to agents. If you're successful, then you sign a contract with this agent that basically says you're going to work together on this book and that you're not going to take the book elsewhere. Usually the agent process takes anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 years. If you don't already have an agent, if this is the first time you're finding an agent, it's going to be more along the lines of 1 to 2 years. My first agent that I ever got for my literary novel, my first novel that I sold, it took 9 months to find that agent. The second time I found an agent, it only took 2 weeks. So it really depends on whether or not you already have a book, whether or not you already have an agent, etc. So my agent, Erin Harris, works primarily with literary fiction and commercial fiction. So she does not work with a lot of graphic novels. So what happened when I needed an agent for my graphic novel was that she pulled in a friend of hers who works on graphic novels, and they worked together. But if you don't have an agent to begin with, you would write a query letter and go through that whole process. Then once you sign on with an agent, you're usually looking at 2 to 3 rounds of revisions on your manuscript with that agent. And this can take anywhere from a couple of months to years. For Shakti, I think it took 2 or 3 months for our revision process. And it was like 3 different rounds of revisions over 3 months. And for my second literary novel, Blue Skinned Gods, it took 2 years, and it was round on round on round of revision. So you never know how long this is going to take. Then when you and your agent agree that this is the best manuscript that you can possibly produce, that there's nothing else you can really do to make it better, then it's you go on submission to publishers, and it's often called going on sub. So essentially, your agent makes a list of publishers that might be interested in your work, and editors specifically at those publishing houses that might be interested in your book, and then they send it out, and then you wait. Publishing is a lot of waiting. So usually it takes editors anywhere from a month to 6 months to get back to you. And hopefully you will have, in that process, you will get some sort of offer. My first book, the literary novel, Marriage of a Thousand Lies, took 15 months to sell to a publisher. And Shakti took 2 weeks. So it really depends on the kind of book, the timing, the kind of zeitgeist that you are submitting into in terms of cultural trends and what's going on in the cultural imagination and discourse. It really, really is a timing issue, and it's a matter of luck, whether how fast your book might sell or whether it might sell at all. I have had one book that I've been trying to sell in various formats for a very long time, and it's been rejected over and over and over every single time. So maybe the timing isn't quite right for that. And hopefully by the end of this process, you will get offers from one or more publishers. If you have offers from more than one publisher, what happens is usually an auction, which is the process by which your book is held for auction. Multiple people put in their bids, multiple publishing houses, multiple editors will put in their bids for your book, and will try to outbid each other. And this is often how you can get the money gets inflated. When you sell a book, you get what is called an advance. When you sell a trade book to a trade publisher, you get what's called an advance, which is an advance against royalties. Essentially, you have to make back that amount of royalties before you can get royalties in the mail. But the advance, you don't have to give back. It is a show of the publisher's investment in you and in your work. And that advance can vary widely from a few $1,000s to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the auction is usually when that price, that advance price, gets pushed to those higher limits. And then at the end of this whole process, hopefully, if you are lucky, you will sign a book deal contract with a publisher. And if your book does go to auction, then you get to have you get to pick essentially which offer you're going to take. Shakti was the only book of mine that went to auction, and we got several different, I think six publishers interested. And so it was a really interesting process for me. It was the first time that had ever happened with my work. So it was completely new process. And it was really interesting to go through it and to understand how that mechanism works. So at the end of the day, I signed a book deal contract with HarperCollins. So this is my last slide. I'm just telling you now so that maybe you can put some questions in the comments or questions in the Q&A. And just to say, I'm a very open person. I don't really, I am willing to and happy to answer questions about anything you might want to know about. So this is the continuation of the process. After you sign the book deal, what happens? You go through multiple rounds of revisions with the editor again. And this is for comics, for graphic novels, this is going to be just on the script. I think it took for Shakti 4 months of revisions with my editor at HarperCollins to finally end up with a manuscript that everybody was happy with. Then you find an illustrator. Usually your press will suggest a list of illustrators. They sent me a list. And I actually said, I have a dream illustrator in mind. Would you possibly consider taking them on? And then they were happy to reach out to that illustrator, and Nabi said yes. So I got to work with the illustrator that I had been imagining when I wrote the book. But that doesn't always happen, but it's something that is really magical when it does. Then you do character sketches, you do pencils, you do full color, and then you work on the cover design together. Then you get what's called galleys, or ARCs, which are advanced reader copies. And these are early prints of your work. So no matter if your final product is going to appear in hardcover or paperback, hardcover means you have a hard cardboard cover on the book. Paperback kind of is wiggly. No matter what the final product will look like, the ARC is almost always in paperback, and it's never given to the public. The ARCs are specifically for book reviewers, people who are going to blurb your book, which means the blurb is like the quote from a famous person that appears on the back cover of a particular book. Of a lot of trade books. Booksellers get ARCs, so independent bookstores will get ARCs, and the booksellers there will decide which books to stock based on the ARCs that they get. And then ARCs also go to a limited number of influencers and other people who might be useful for the book. And then after that process, you get to the final book, and you get your copies in the mail, and your book appears on bookshelves, hopefully, and hopefully does well. So that at that point, that final point of the process, you're releasing your trade book out into the world, and it's really out of your control at that point. So this is kind of the process. And I hope that was useful for you. I hope that it was educational at the very least. And now Christina will help me field some questions.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much, and congratulations for landing such a great contract with HarperCollins. And I love the intrigue of having multiple publishers fight for your book. This is remarkable. I don't think it happens as much for academic books, although sometimes it does happen. There's bidding going on, and I just wanted to say congratulations on making that happen. We have some questions, quite a few trickling in. Before we move on, I wanted to also note that this is probably one of our first webinars when 45 people sign up and they actually show up. So kudos and thank you so much for being here and for staying here. I saw Constance Relihan was here, the dean of the University College, excuse me. And I wanted to mention and thank our speaker today, as well as the co-directors of the lab, for attending this wonderful panel just last week. I think it was on Wednesday. Some of my students and I went right after class on why comics matter. And this is in the series of the common book events at VCU. And I posted a link if you'd like to check the remaining events. But I thought, and Bernard Means is also here. So looking forward to hearing your question as well. So let's dive right in. This quite a few questions. I will start with Rani's question, because I know Rani is also a graphic artist. And the question for Rani, from Rani is, do you have any advice for writers who want to improve on their graphic novel writing specifically?
I do. If you haven't read the Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, I highly recommend it. It's really technical. My students were very, very surprised at how technical but also theoretical it was, and I think they were just kind of expecting something a little bit more I don't know, basic, but what they got was extremely theoretical, and it's a super interesting book. He also has another one called Making Comics that I would recommend if you are somebody who's interested in the creation of comics. The other craft book, the craft text that I would recommend is the Rose Medal Press Field Guide to Graphic Literature. It just came out like maybe a few months ago, and it is really fantastic. It goes through not only traditional comics and traditional graphic novels, but also comics poetry and avant-garde stuff, and the avant-garde tradition within comics, which is really, really interesting. So I would recommend those. And then I would recommend reading comic scripts, not in comic form, but in script form. And you can find a whole bunch of scripts online. I know Neil Gaiman has a ton of his scripts released. But there's a book called Panel One, which is basically a compilation of a bunch of comic scripts in different formats by famous script writers. And that book is really really useful in trying to figure out like what format works for me, how do I think best in terms of the visual form, and then how do I adapt it into a script. So those are the things I'd recommend.
Wonderful. And also joining the lab, joining the graphic narratives lab at the HRC, is that an option as well for people to learn more?
Yes. The graphic narratives lab is, we're hoping to put on a bunch of events, some of which are focusing on the creation of comics by comics artists. So if you're interested in that, keep an eye on the website. I think it was posted in the chat. So please, and if you can't find it, you just Google VCU graphic narratives lab and it's the first thing that comes up. So keep an eye on our website.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to go back to the Q&A, and I'll try to field that. There are quite a few questions, and I'm trying to make sure we get to all of them. So from an anonymous attendee, do you have any advice for students interested in publishing indie comics, self-publishing, maybe?
Again, the Graphic Narratives Lab is a great resource to kind of learn more. Each of the co-directors also teaches classes that are comics focused. So I would look at the website for the Graphic Narratives Lab, and the courses are listed. So when you see those courses, I would try to take them to kind of get some hands-on experience with either the scholarship side or the creation side, both of which I think are really useful to have.
Thank you so much. A question from Talisha Tarver. Do you think zine publishing is a good way to get started if you're an amateur like me? Thank you, Talisha, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think zines are really wonderful, especially because they have a history of just sort of indie DIY kind of publishing, which I think is really important as well. I'm more on the traditional publishing side, but I also understand that, you know, small press publishing and indie publishing is really important, and that the entire publishing ecosystem relies on all of those things to function well, and to be healthy. So absolutely, I think zine publishing is a great way to start.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. A question from one of our English majors, potential member of the lab, Madeline. Madeline Trice asks, what advice would you give to someone looking for an agent for the first time? It's a great question.
I would say strap in. It's often a long and frustrating process, but it can be a really fruitful process. And I feel like a lot of people get frustrated and give up before it might bear fruit. So just kind of get in for the long haul. There's a lot of emphasis now on these pitch wars on Twitter, where all these agents are there and you're like trying to pitch along with thousands of other people. It's fine, but you also have the very normal method of writing a query letter and sending it out to agents. So it's really important to keep that process in mind too, that is a very real way to find an agent. I would also say that you should check out Friedman. Is it Jennifer Friedman? I think is the writer. She's an agent, and she worked as an editor. She has on her website is a huge compendium of resources on how to write a query letter, how to write a book proposal. All of it is there. So yeah, that's please check that out. There's a lot of resources online.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to try to combine
Friedman.
two questions. Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. So I'm going to try to combine a question from our colleague in the English department, Catherine Seltzer, with our colleague from the School of World Studies, Mark Wood. So Catherine asks, what was most difficult for you in approaching this book as a collaborative process, as opposed to the individual, even isolated process of writing a more traditional novel on the one hand? And I think Mark's question adds a little bit to this in what do you like about writing and creating graphic novels, and what do you hope people enjoy and take away from reading your works? Slightly different, but I think they fit the same.
I actually think my answer is the same in that in any sort of collaborative process, there is an important part where you have to let go of control. If you are somebody who likes to keep tight control of your own work, maybe collaboration is not the answer. But as somebody, I'm a perfectionist, but at the same time, this process was really enlightening for me and really useful in learning how to collaborate in a creative space. And you just have to give up control. You have control over the script, and that's about it. And then, once the illustrator steps forward, it's them, and you're working in collaboration with them, but they also get to take the reins and have a lot of creative control. So it's really about respecting each other's creativity and process, and not trying to keep such control over your own work. And I think the best part was also that I could give up control, and seeing those sketches for the first time, the entire book interpreted by a different person, my story interpreted by a different person, it was very moving. It was very, very moving. I think I almost cried just from seeing that, from seeing my story come to life in a way. So it can also be a really rewarding process.
Mm-hmm. Or not, some cases,
yes.
Right? Which I think gets us to the next question. Mimi Winnick asks, and I think she, means that in a positive sense as well. Mm-hmm. But because we received so much rejection in academia, I think it's useful to learn how we negotiate those, right? Especially since we are in the publishing business. So Mimi's question is, do you have any advice about being open to and acting on feedback? And this is where I read, perhaps sometimes negative feedback or positive. Mm-hmm. What advice do you have, especially for newbies, but also for the more seasoned writers who are constantly dealing with this, as you described it, this avalanche of rounds of feedback? Thank you, Mimi, for the great question.
Yes, thank you. That is a wonderful question. I think that feedback is so important and to the creative process. I think good feedback and this is not to say positive feedback, this could be negative critique as well. I mean, good critique can push your work to levels of excellence that you didn't think you could reach, and maybe you wouldn't have been able to reach by yourself. Again, it's a sort of collaborative process where you still retain control of what ultimately, what changes you ultimately make, but at the same time, you may not have made those changes without getting that feedback. I think feedback is important. I think feedback is necessary. And as a writer, being able to integrate feedback and hear feedback is so important. On the flip side, it is also important to learn how to hear feedback through the filter of who is giving that feedback. Sometimes when people give feedback, they're pointing to a problem with the story or an issue with your work that they can't articulate, that they can't fully articulate. And the problem that they see might not be the actual problem. It might be something else, but their discomfort or what they're pointing to needs to be filtered through who they are. So, if you're getting feedback from somebody in your class who really hates you, you have to hear it through that filter. Right? I got feedback on a critical paper once from a peer review reader who clearly didn't read past the title. Like I could tell, he was only critiquing the title. And so it's important to be able to have to see feedback from a critical lens as well, and to question it and to be engaged with it critically.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we can take 2 more questions, and then let's go to Ivy's question. Ivy Warsham. I think this is a fan of your work, and also somebody who's actually read Shakti, and I don't know, but maybe a potential lab member, who knows. So congratulations, wonderful book. I'm curious to hear about your process of writing the story / creating the plot, as far as including mythology. Did you start out knowing that you wanted to include the Durga Ma and Kali Ma, and using that lens to explore them, or to explore the theme of bullying and vice versa? Or how did that work?
It was a very organic process. I knew that they were going to be involved somehow in the magic system, but I actually didn't know how it was all going to come together when I started writing it. I just knew that there was some connection that the main character Shakti has with this goddess Durga, and that she derives her magic from there. But I actually didn't know how it was going to connect to bullying and all of that until I started actually writing the book. And that's usually how it works for me. I know some things going in, but I don't know everything going in. I'm trying to change that. I'm trying to do a lot more pre-writing and figuring out of that stuff before I start writing the actual story. But with Shakti, it was very much an organic process where it built upon itself. I knew I was going to introduce mythology, Hindu mythology in particular, but I didn't know exactly how that was going to happen. It ended up being that I changed quite a bit of the mythology. I fictionalized a lot of the mythology. I changed it from its origin because I found that the mythology had already been changed from its indigenous origins. And it had been kind of papered over with patriarchy. And I was just, in my version, I'm trying to remove a lot of those layers of patriarchy that have been put on indigenous stories. And so part of that work was unearthing or trying to reimagine those mythologies from a more indigenous perspective. So that was a lot of my kind of work with the mythology in that book.
Mm. Wonderful. And I think we have time for one question from, and this may be a personal question, so you can choose not to answer, or you can choose to go elsewhere. But Rumi Balasubramanian asks, what is one of your memories from visiting your family in Sri Lanka? And I'm assuming that question also connects to how this has influenced your conception of Shakti.
Yeah, so I actually went back to Sri Lanka this past summer on a research trip to get. I needed to take physical photos of where my next graphic novel, Tall Water, is set in Sri Lanka, because you can't find those photos online, and I needed to actually get it right. So I went back to do research for my literary novel and to get those photos. But I did see a lot of my family while I was there, and it was really interesting. I've always thought of myself as a displaced person. I grew up in the Sri Lankan Civil War, and I have been displaced from my homeland for a very long time. And the most surprising thing about seeing my family, but also seeing the place, was understanding that that sense of home is still there. I felt really rooted to the place and the people in a way that I haven't felt in a very long time. And I think that that's going to continue to affect my work moving forward.
Wonderful. And I know we are at time, but I have one question which I would like to ask. And thank you to those who are still here. I wanted to ask you in closing about the reception of your novel, graphic novel, which came out in May this year, right? Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about that and how you're taking that reception, in revising or creating new work? We know you're very busy with.
Yeah, and this is my first book for kids, and I've never written for kids before, and it's been one of the most heartening receptions I have ever had. I visited a 5th grade classroom that was reading my book, and I talked to a bunch of the students, especially the South Asian students, who were able, even in 5th grade, to understand some of the deeper levels of the mythology, and were able to see themselves in the characters, and were able to understand some of the language that's not English. Even the meaning of Shakti, they knew what her name meant, and just to see that kind of recognition in their eyes that they usually never get to have in American literature was just so amazing. It was amazing. Not all the reception has been good. Some people have been very upset that I changed Hindu mythology and took away the patriarchy from some of the mythology. And so they were upset that Durga had dark skin. Indigenous depictions of Durga have dark skin, but it's been sort of lightened over time and over colonization, and I took that back, and people were upset about that. So it hasn't always been positive, but to me it's been positive. It's been creating some interesting conversations out in the world. So that's really my goal.
Absolutely. And, maybe there is no bad publicity. It's
exactly.
Just publicity. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sindu. And thank you, everyone, for attending. I have just a few reminders in closing. And if you couldn't make it, we'll have a recording of the event on our website in the next few days. For those of you interested in our other offerings, tonight we're hosting a screening, The Lives Between the Lines, a screening and discussion with the director. And I hope many of you will attend. Rani can post the details in the chat. And on Wednesday, we're co-sponsoring a symposium on new perspectives on health and equity through the humanities. And we're very excited to really bring the humanities and infuse all sorts of campus conversations with humanistic perspectives. And so we invite you to check that out and join us if possible. We have our next event in the Meet VCU Author Series will be on October 9th at noon, also on Zoom, when we'll welcome Professor David Shields, who is an associate professor of graphic design in the School of the Arts. He'll talk about his new book called The Rob Roy Kelly Wood Type Collection. And moving into early October, we're very excited to welcome in person Karma Chavez, who is professor of Mexican American and Latinx Studies at UT Austin, who will be giving a talk on her book at 4 p.m. on October the 5th, her book titled The Borders of AIDS in the Commons Theater. And thank you so much for supporting these events, for showing up, for asking such great questions, and for buying the books, right? Occasionally, especially the ones that appeal to you. Thank you so much, SJ Sindu, and thank you, colleagues. I will see you in the next 2 weeks, if not sooner. Thanks so much. Have a wonderful week.
Thanks.
Thank you.